Well, then by show of hands, honorable senators would want to vote by a show of hands on the amendments? Sure. Okay. All those in favor of the motion introduced by Senator Carignan, please raise your hand. All those opposed? Pardon?
Inaudible, please. Senator Boniface was left and has been replaced by Senator Pate.
All those who abstain?
Non, j'aurais besoin des qui sont contre.
All those opposed? Sorry. All those who abstain? I do. So, you're sure it's 5? No. Senator Munson has voted for them.
Don't touch my foot.
Says voted. Wait, 6. Right. So the amendment is defeated. 6-5. Shall clause 1 to 10 carry? There's no more amendments in that group. Shall I call again? Shall clause 1 to 10 carry? On division. Shall clause 11 to 20 carry? I see that there are many amendments to clause 15, and on those amendments, I will call Senator Boisvenu, who is the first one to introduce the various amendments to clause 15.
Oui, merci beaucoup.
Senator Boisvenu.
Merci beaucoup.
On clause 15.
Oui. Alors, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Indeed, there are 4 amendments. And these 4 amendments have been tabled by the main victims groups who appeared before the committee. So the first concerns Clause 15 on page 15, and it is moved that Bill C-46 be amended in Clause 15 on page 15 by replacing line 24 with the following. Everyone commits the offense of vehicular homicide as a result of impaired driving who commits an OF and what follows. So this amendment comes from a commitment that Justin Trudeau made in 2015 when he was meeting with the victims group. It was Families for Justice, and it was in the context of Bill C-52 at the time. And he said, as you know, the passing of the Cassandra Act would mean that impaired driving causing death would be vehicular homicide as a result of impaired driving. And this is exactly what we're putting in here. And it concerns someone found guilty of killing another person. And therefore, I am moving this amendment to the bill so that that appears in the bill, vehicular homicide. Any other comments on Senator Boisvenu's motion? Or Senator Gold? Yes, just a question, dear colleague. Can you just explain a little bit what the consequences of this amendment would be in terms of the sentence imposed or the court's appearance before the courts? Well, it doesn't change much in terms of a court appearance because you could be sentenced to life for that. The wording doesn't change much in that regard. But what it changes is for the families of victims that this is much more of a deterrent message than if it is just someone convicted of impaired driving. So for the victims, when they're faced with this kind of an offense, they are looking at someone who voluntarily consumed either drugs or alcohol and then committed a criminal offense with a vehicle. And for those families, victims' families rather, that vehicle has become a weapon, and so they have voluntarily committed this as opposed to involuntary manslaughter or something of that nature. Microphone, please. It would be possible, yes.
Or Madame Morancy or any of the other officer, would you come at the table, identify yourself?
Excuse me.
Mr. Joanne Wells,
Thank you.
and could you give your titles, please?
Thank you. My name is Joanna Wells. I'm counsel with the Criminal Law Policy Section at the Department of Justice.
We're listening to you.
If I could just add a few comments that may help the committee in this. The terminology that's been suggested may not necessarily be appropriate for the objectives of the motion. Homicide is quite broad of a legal term. It includes, in the criminal code, murder, manslaughter, and infanticide. And vehicle may be too narrow, as it wouldn't include all the other conveyances that are contemplated in the impaired driving regime.
I'm sorry, would you push your button, Senator, because
So using this kind of language, replacing what's in the bill right now and using this kind of language, what sort of impact could it have, or if any? Practical impact, I mean, on the interpretation or whatever.
Well, it wouldn't change the penalty, as was noted, as it's already punishable by life imprisonment. But it may have the impact of bringing in terminology that doesn't match, if you will, some of the other terms used in the code.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
And thank you. And we, Senator Boisvenu, Senator McIntyre.
Senator Boisvenu. Well, just for clarification, you said that it would have an impact on other forms of transportation. Could you give an example?
The amendment proposes vehicular homicide, but the offense itself would apply if a vessel was involved or an aircraft or railway equipment. So vehicle implies motor vehicle, which is one type of conveyance, but may not be seen as being broad enough or an appropriate term in this context.
But I'm trying to extend the reasoning. Our impaired driving charge is not almost exclusively through the use of motor vehicles, people driving on roads?
But it's not, they're not exclusively.
Okay. Et quel impact ça aurait sur d'autres?
And what impact would that have? For example, a jet ski or something, or someone who's impaired hits a swimmer on the lake. What impact would that have? Just strictly saying vehicular and in comparison with that, say, jet ski example.
Impaired driving offenses can be applied if an operator is operating a jet ski. It's been determined as a vessel. The point I was trying to make is the terminology of vehicular homicide may not be the correct terminology to capture all types of conveyances, which is one of the objectives of C46 itself, is to clarify, clean up, and simplify the language used.
Mais ça n'aurait aucun impact sur un exemple.
But it wouldn't have any impact on the offense that would be committed using some other kind of conveyance. For example, if you're driving, it would be particularly specified in this case because the great majority of people who are impaired are behind the wheel of a motor vehicle. But it wouldn't have an impact on the dangerous driving causing the death of someone using another kind of conveyance.
Act on the actual conviction or the sentence.
Merci, Senator McIntyre.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Wells, for your presentation. As you've indicated, homicide includes murder and manslaughter. Manslaughter is the killing of a human being by means of an unlawful act, okay? Now, we also have impaired driving causing death and criminal negligence causing death. Would vehicular homicide include criminal negligence causing death or impaired driving causing death?
With respect to this amendment, I wouldn't think criminal negligence causing death is a separate offense that is not captured by the proposed amendment.
Okay, so vehicle homicide is somewhat stronger than impaired driving causing death or criminal negligence causing death. Would that be so?
Well, if it wouldn't change the penalty, I wouldn't want to comment on whether or not it would be stronger or not. The penalty for impaired driving causing death is up to a maximum of life imprisonment, which is the most serious.
That's not mandatory. That's up to the judge. The judge has a discretion there. Yeah.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Dupuis, suivi du Sénateur Pratt.
Senator Dupuis, followed by Senator Pratt. Thank you. I'd like to understand the argument of the weapon. In other words, if I understand what the argument that's being put forward, and I would like some clarification, I'd like Ms. Wells to stay there. I would like your opinion on this. We want to specify, or we want to create a new criminal offense, if I understand correctly, in addition to that, those which already exist, by creating this new vehicular homicide offense. And Senator Boisvenu, you were referring to cars, which would be the equivalent of a weapon, according to some of the families you heard from. So could you help me understand that? Because my question to you, Ms. Wells, is how would this work in conjunction with the other provisions of the criminal code that involve using weapons that cause bodily harm or death, for example?
6 or in the amendment that speaks to vehicles as weapons. So
Non,
just
c'est
to
pour
be
ça que la
clear of
question
that.
était au sénateur Boisvenu parce que c'est...
No, well, that question was to Senator Boisvenu because when he presented his motion, he mentioned that. No, it's not a connection with a weapon. I'm just saying we're not creating a new offense. It's just being described differently. Currently, it is impaired driving causing death. And this just puts in the concept of the vehicular homicide causing death. So I did this because of the families we heard from. So that's an image of Senator Dupuis. So someone who's in a bar, for example, who consumes drugs or alcohol and decides to take their vehicle and kill someone, for those families, the vehicle has become a weapon. So the whole concept of impaired driving causing death, it sounds to them like an accident, whereas they say in the end it's more than that. The person who took the wheel while impaired, for the victims' families, it involves a whole concept of them having committed this crime. There's an intention there. So the whole notion of homicide is part of a different category of crime. So it's really just as an image that I spoke about weapons. There's not a weapon in the traditional sense. Senator Pratt? I understand the intention underlying this amendment, but I have an impression that we're sliding into a use of words that's a little risky. Now I'm on unknown territory here, but I think that the criminal code involves many different concepts that go from murder to involuntary, or to manslaughter, rather. So I think that just using the word homicide represents different things. And I understand that there is the concept of very serious intent when someone who's impaired takes the wheel and causes the death of someone. But can we really compare that responsibility to someone who commits a murder with the clear intention of killing a person? It seems to me to be not quite the same thing. So when we use the word homicide, we're using a word that has many different definitions within the criminal code, and we don't have all of that here. In your amendment, we just have the word homicide. Well, yes, that's right. It's because the whole notion of this homicide that's almost accidental, in the end, it seems sort of lower down on the scale of values in terms of the victim's family, whereas this impaired driving offense here has a voluntary aspect to it, but these words are important to the victim's families. Well, it's not the same thing as a murder, though. Well, no, but manslaughter is not the same thing as a murder either. I mean, we use the word homicide in French. So.
Different in French, but homicide can be culpable and non-culpable. And so it doesn't necessarily mean, I think, what you're intending, Senator Boisvenu, if it's in English, because homicide doesn't necessarily mean culpable.
Mm-hmm.
Je comprends tout ça.
I understand all of that. But that's not what my argument is. What I'm saying is that one of the only actions taken where we're taking someone's life, and that you're not talking homicide. I mean, if someone's in a fight and they punch someone and kill them, they don't have the intention of killing the person, but that's still called homicide. It's one of the only crimes, because it's a crime to drive while impaired. But people don't dare use the word homicide. They just talk about impaired driving. And so for the recidivist, the repeat offender, for that person, the fact that there's no concept of homicide, it makes it seem like it's a lesser crime. And yes, perhaps it's just words, but it has tremendous meaning for the families of the victims. Senator Dupuis. I'm going to ask Ms. Wells the question, first of all. Does this exist in the criminal code, the whole concept of homicide, period?
In section 222, it's a fairly complex provision. As Senator Pate pointed out, it distinguishes between culpable and non-culpable homicide.
Tout à fait.
Culpable homicide includes, as I mentioned, murder, manslaughter, and infanticide in that category, which is one of the reasons why the term homicide may be considered as too broad, because it does include all three of those types of culpable homicide.
Ce que je veux savoir, c'est...
What I want to know is exactly that to say that it's either culpable or non-culpable, you can't just have a simple homicide without those qualifiers.
Question specifically, homicide that is not culpable is not criminal. So to be a criminal offense, it has to be a culpable homicide, which includes those three categories. It's section, yes, 222.
222.
Mais oui, l'homicide est coupable.
Yes, it's either culpable or non-culpable. Therefore, it's voluntary or involuntary. Do I understand correctly? In other words, I'm trying to understand the amendment before us and where exactly it would fall. And if it's a vehicular homicide, does it need to be qualified to be either voluntary or involuntary?
Motion before you, the effect of the amendment would be to change the name of the offense, essentially, to vehicular homicide instead of impaired driving causing death.
Oui, ça, je comprends ça. C'est pas ça ma question. Ma question, c'est où est-ce que ça vient s'intégrer?
Yes, but I understand that. But how would it be integrated into our system of criminal law compared to a voluntary or involuntary homicide or a murder? So would it line up somewhere in that list, or because my next question would be, compared to, say, involuntary homicide because a person is enraged, I'm trying to see that if a person is drunk, could it be seen as a voluntary homicide or an involuntary homicide because there's a loss of the person's ability to appreciate what they're doing. They're impaired. So if so someone in that situation has lost control. They're not behind the wheel of a car, but they've lost control of their behavior.
Whether or not it's involuntary versus a voluntary act with respect to the motion that's before you. There would not be a substantive change to what the Crown would need to prove the offense of impaired driving causing death. It wouldn't change the penalty once convicted, or the possible penalty once convicted. It would be a unique phrase in the Canadian criminal law, but it wouldn't necessarily have an impact on the way homicide is interpreted generally.
If I may submit an interpretation and get your reaction, Section 222 states a person commits homicide when directly or indirectly by any means he causes the death of a human being. So the word homicide is used in relation to death. The way that subsection 2 that is the object of Senator Boisvenu is in fact not only related to death, but in fact it refers to cause bodily harm to another person. So if you cause bodily harm to a person, it would be Section 221 of the Code, because that doesn't ensue from the bodily harm, while homicide, that is the result. Well, but that's, yeah, but that's
Inaudible comment from Senator Carignan.
Cause des lésions corporelles à une autre personne. Donc,
causing bodily harm to another person. What that section mentions is an offense, essentially, when we cause bodily harm to another person, but then afterwards it refers to Clause 3, which causes the death of another person. So obviously we're talking about homicide if we're talking about 222.
Between the type of the label of the crime, comma, if you causes bodily harm, versus if you through your act you cause the death. So the two sections 2 and 3 reflect in fact 221 and 222, but in Section 3 we don't call it an homicide, and that's what the purpose of Senator Boisvenu is in fact to identify sub 3 as an act under that is equivalent to 222. That's the way I read the code.
I don't disagree with your interpretation of the code. The impaired driving causing death is a type of homicide.
That's what I think.
Yes, but homicide as a term includes more than impaired driving causing bodily harm.
Course.
So one fits better
of course.
Under the other.
I totally agree with your interpretation in relation to that. That's the intent behind the amendment of Senator Boisvenu. My other concern is that would it thwart the interpretation of the code in other sections where the code referred to homicide? I mean, in order to maintain the rationality of the interpretation of the code. I'm sorry, I didn't want to upstage you, Senator, to ask the question. But that's
No, that's exactly what I was trying to understand.
related to the question.
So it could cause confusion in that provision because it would use a term that would in a sense be too broad, and part of the proposed approach of C46 as a whole, as a bill, is to reduce the confusion that already exists in the impaired driving regime, to clarify, to use simpler terms, modern drafting approaches, And so it's possible that this type of amendment could lead to confusion in terminology.
Senator Gold, followed by Senator McIntyre, followed by Senator Gould.
The difference between murder and manslaughter is the mens rea, right? Is the mens rea, okay? Because in murder, in first-degree murder, you need the specific intent to kill, okay? And then you need the planning. In second-degree murder, you need a general intent as opposed to a specific intent, or an intent to cause bodily harm, knowing that it would result into the death, and you were reckless whether death ensued or not. Manslaughter is the killing of a human being by means of an unlawful act. And as Senator Boisvenu has stated, if A punches B in the face and B, hits his or her rock on and dies, that's manslaughter, okay? So as I understand, impaired, the offense of vehicular homicide would replace impaired driving causing death. Would that be it?
That would be the effect of the amendment to
That
change
would
the
be the
name
effect of the amendment,
change the name
yes.
of the offense of causing death.
Yeah.
Yes, it also would lead to an inconsistent naming protocol as between causing bodily harm and causing death. But yes, I agree with you, Senator McIntyre. That would be the.
But it seems to me that
effect.
the word vehicular homicide gives it more strength, more force, than just impaired driving causing death. It's like stronger, I find. Yeah.
But as you
Maybe
stated,
not in terms of the penalty, but in terms of the definition
but
of the
in
word.
terms of penalty, it's the same penalty.
The same
as
penalty,
you stated.
That's correct.
Yeah, up to life imprisonment. Senator, Senator Gould.
No, I do understand the significance of it and the significance of it for victims. But I would be reluctant to introduce a change for those reasons that could have an unsettling effect on the interpretation of other provisions of the criminal code. I'm persuaded that since it does not actually affect the penalties, since this bill as a whole strengthens protection of Canadians against impaired driving, both alcohol and drug impaired driving, I think it's unnecessary to take the chance that we're introducing language that may have unintended consequences in other areas of the code.
Senator Dupuis, followed by Senator Carignan.
J'essayais juste de comprendre si à partir.
I was just trying to understand, because what I'm thinking is what Senator Gold just said. That's my main concern. It wasn't the word vehicular. The fact that you've killed someone, whether it's with a car or not, it's a homicide. So is it the introduction of the word vehicular that doesn't really, that compromises the whole system that we have here? Because if you're driving a plane, are you not at the wheel? I think the concern that we have is not to want to add in a term here, as Senator Gold was saying, that might undermine the existing regime. Senator Carignan. I think we should vote on this because we have many more amendments.
Vote. So the roll call, please.
L'honorable Sénateur Joyal, PC.
Abstention.
The Honorable Senator Batters.
For.
L'honorable Sénateur Boisvenu.
Pour.
L'honorable Sénateur Carignan, CP. L'honorable Sénateur Dagenet. L'honorable Sénatrice Dupuis. L'honorable Sénateur Gold.
Contre.
The Honorable Senator Omubar.
Against.
L'honorable Senator McIntyre.
Pour.
The Honorable Senator Munson.
Against.
The Honorable Senator Pate.
Against.
L'honorable Sénateur Pratt.
L'amendement est défait.
The amendment is defeated.